Good morning and welcome to London. In these turbulent and challenging times, increased government intervention in the mining industry is not generally welcome. However, across much of the mining world, it is a factor that we have to learn how to live with. Resource nationalism. Is it all bad news and simply enforced transfer of value? Or does it hold potential benefits for our industry? I will try to explore how we can find opportunity in adversity and what it will take to come out on the right side of this challenge. The first slide of my presentation is of Africa. The map shows the different types of political regimes across the continent. Most of my working life and experience has been in Africa, and I will therefore concentrate on African examples. But the present wave of growing resource nationalism is a global phenomenon, and there are a few interesting current examples ranging from Australia to Chile that I may touch on. We as the mining industry cannot hide from the impact and consequences of the growing trend of resource nationalism. And in my view, this trend is a long-term one and not one that will go away. In some cases, we have the luxury of deciding where we invest and mine. But unfortunately, unexploited mineable resources are often not in convenient locations. And if mining companies want to grow and succeed, they often have to go where the resources are. If, for instance, a new government in Tanzania were to radically increase export duties, a gold junior may well be able to reallocate resources away from Tanzania to some other country. But if you're a Rio or a Vale and you want to remain a major force in seaborne iron ore, you cannot afford to ignore the Samandu iron ore fields in Guinea, and you therefore have to deal with the aspirations of the government of Alpha Conde, whether you like it or not. Probably in this case not. The need to face up to new political and social realities in resource-rich countries applies to juniors, mid-tier companies, and multinational majors as much as it does to the Chinese and to other long-term strategic players. The tools available to a Canadian or Australian junior may be very different from those available to the Chinese government or to ExxonMobil. But in my view, the correct way forward remains the same. In fact, in many ways, the smaller and nimbler players can come out on top in this present game. In Africa and across much of the developing world, it is clear where this trend of growing resource nationalism comes from. It comes from growing democratisation and an increasing sensitivity even amongst autocratic regimes to populist and media sentiments. Whether we like it or not, in much of the developing world, the mining industry is perceived as having been a largely exploitative tool of imperialist interests. The history of mining is seen as a history of exploiting the wealth of the nation for the benefit of foreign interests. Regimes who need to either get re-elected in volatile environments or in some cases wish to avoid the need for elections must therefore be seen to be redressing this perceived historical wrong. The combination of this imperative, together with fiscal demands in times of economic stress, and perceived unreasonable profits of mining companies while commodity prices remain relatively strong, creates an irresistible political momentum. The effects on the mining industry of this macro trend are magnified by both the growing capacity on the part of many developing world governments, giving them more tools to use, and by their growing confidence. Western powers are no longer seen as quite as frightening as they once were, particularly given the Western world's present structural challenges. And the presence of the Chinese has created choices to balance the influence of the traditional players. I don't want to spend our time going into the history of how resource nationalism has manifested itself over the decades since the end of colonialism and the different phases of taxation and nationalization that the mining industry has lived through. This is an interesting and relevant story, but let's rather focus on where we are today and how the new wave of resource nationalism is taking shape. It comes in a number of forms. Firstly, we have punitive increases in tax and royalty regimes, such as those being either introduced or proposed in Zambia, Peru, and Australia. These are generally short-term responses to fiscal stress and to the perceived commodity supercycle. They are costly and disruptive to efficient planning and capital allocation, and in my view, are often a symptom of the industry's failure to educate their host governments and to engage in developing alternative models of state participation. I will return later to what I mean by this and what I think we should do about it. Secondly, we see increasingly insertive implementation of use it or lose it type regulations. These are seen as a manifestation of resource nationalism, but in my view are largely a constructive response to the dominance in many frontier markets of short-term opportunistic investors, which has resulted in the underdevelopment of many viable mid-tier projects. If these regulations are correctly and fairly administered, I believe that they are entirely positive for the industry as a whole and should be encouraged. Thirdly, we have legislation limiting foreign ownership of strategic resources. This is not really a factor on the African scene, where the need for foreign capital and expertise is almost universally appreciated. It is, however, a growing trend in countries as diverse as Russia and Venezuela, and the remarkable derailing of the BHP potash deal in Canada can also be put in this category. The roots of this nationalism lie largely in the purely political domain. And I'm afraid that other than showing that we are good and obedient corporate citizens, there is not much that the mining industry can do about it other than resist it on a case-by-case basis. Fourthly, there are increasing demands across much of the resource world for greater levels of local beneficiation. Examples such as the banning of the exports of unsmelted tin from Indonesia have proved very successful in the creation of a substantial local smelting industry. Likewise, the encouragement of local diamond cutting industries in Botswana and Namibia has had a degree of success. While this may be suitable for tin and to some extent for diamonds, the processing of many metals and minerals in their country of origin can be sub-economic and inefficient, and is only desirable where it can be sustainably competitive without subsidies or legal mandate. Lastly is the area which, in my view, represents the most opportunity and where we can have a very real impact. This is the creation of new legislation and models for the enhanced equity participation in mining companies and projects on the part of either state structures or local private interests. This has ranged from affirmative action legislation in South Africa and the punitive 51% local ownership requirements of Zimbabwe to the new mining codes of Guinea and the proposed mining legislation of the newly elected SATA government in Zambia, calling for up to 35% government ownership in all existing and new mining projects. This often goes hand in hand with the creation of national mining companies to hold state interests in mining assets. On the one hand, this is the most dangerous trend, as it can be a stepping stone to expropriation and outright nationalization.